order that everyone's sitting here, the order that's in the program. And so we will start with Larry Ferrero, who is a naval architect and historian. He's the 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist for history for his book Brothers in Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. His latest work, Churchill's American Arsenal, How the United States Built the British Inventions that Won World War II, will appear under Oxford University Press in 2022. He received his PhD in the history of science, technology, and engineering from Imperial College in London, and he teaches history and engineering at George Mason University in Virginia and the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. They're confused.
No, it's just my glasses fog up.
He's served for over 40 years as a naval architect and systems engineer in the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, and Department of Defense. And he was an exchange engineer in the French Navy, and he lives with his wife and their sons in Virginia.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. We're going to be talking about technology of armed ocean-going ships and the rise of overseas empire. And the basic question is, if you've heard of the guns, germs, and steel theories of why Europe came to dominate global history, you probably asked the question. Asia had germs, and they had guns, and they had steel, and they also had ocean-going ships, just like Europe. So why was it that European nations and not Asian nations came to dominate world trade between 1400 and 1800? And the short answer is that Europe, and only Europe, was able to develop these large ocean-going vessels, which became a combination of floating warehouses, fortresses, and barracks all in one. The Asian nations, China, for example, the Indian subcontinent, and even today's Indonesia, never saw how to combine these capabilities into one platform. They never developed a coherent answer to these European super weapons. Next slide. So for much of pre-industrial history, maritime trade was carried out by vessels which were broadly similar in capacity and type. They were small, 1 to 2 masts. They were built for local waters. Next slide. The examples are the balsa raft, the dhow, the cog, and the junk or yang of Southeastern Asia. In each case, the balsa rafts of Peru, the dhow of Africa and West Asia, the European cog, the junk or the jong, they had very similar characteristics on paper. Regional trade only, 1 to 2 masts, generally open decks, or at most perhaps 1 enclosed deck, and about 500 tons burthen or less. Now, this was pretty much the case up until the 1400s. Next slide, please. So your next question, I'm anticipating it, is, wait, what about Zheng He? Wasn't he the person who built 20,000-ton heavily armed ships? These were about the size, if you believe that, of a World War II aircraft carrier. Didn't he make 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433 to explore routes for the Ming emperors? No. First of all, his largest ships were perhaps the size of the biggest clipper ships during the 19th century, maybe 2,000 tons. In fact, that replica that you see behind me is of about that size. That replica is in Nanjing. The second and the most important point is that his job was not to go out and explore new maritime routes like Columbus. He actually traveled very well-established trade routes that had been there long before. His job, and his job only, was to crush illegal traders on those routes who weren't contributing to the Ming Emperor's tribute system. He did that job so well that at the very end of those voyages, those illegal traders were so thoroughly crushed that the Ming emperors put a stop to those voyages after that. There was no pullback from the seas because that concept simply didn't exist. Next slide, please. By the 15th century, Asia had the most complex and diverse network of maritime trade, but it was European nation states which began to compete for power via the expansion of their trade from their regional spheres all the way to the Americas and to Asia. Now, they did that because it was the Americas and Asia, it was the Americas and Asia which had the silver, the spices, the silk, the porcelain, and the other things that the Europeans wanted but didn't have. And that's the main reason why it was Europe going to Asia and not Asia coming to Europe. In Asian eyes, for Europe, there's no there. There's nothing that they wanted, so why would they make that voyage in the first place for these very rich Asian nations? Next slide. We can see the difference in the trade routes from about 1400 to 1600. So between 1400 on the top and 1600 on the bottom, what changed? Well, the first was that with the discovery and then the theft of Peruvian and Mexican silver into the trade by the Spanish and Portuguese empires, that put into play a commodity that the Asian nations wanted. But the second and most important change, next slide please, was the introduction of the armed ocean-going European warship into the picture, which was able to carry out trade and dominate trade. And these were the product of nation states and competition between nation states by Europeans themselves. The European nations developed these ships, which were completely new. They were not just armed ships, they weren't just cargo-carrying ships, they also carried the troops necessary to enforce trade, and they were built strong enough to carry both heavy weapons and to withstand the rigors of heavy seas and heavy firepower. Next slide, please. So why did this sudden expansion of armed ocean-going ships happen in Europe and not, say, in Asia? Well, this process was reasonably well, has been reasonably well documented and is fairly well known. The carracks and the caravels started out as primarily regional trading ships, and they evolved and combined to become something that the Spanish called the now, and the carrack was a now, but the Spanish called the galleon, and everybody else pretty much took the same term. European nation states were competing for power via the expansion of trade, not simply war between the nations on the European continent. And that trade began in Europe, but began to expand out to the Americas and most importantly, Asia, which, as I said, is where the spices and other riches that the Europeans wanted was located. Now, you only see these very large ocean-going ships like the galleons built by nation states. You don't really see them built by private and commercial interests. And you don't really see them being built by city-states, not even really Venice, because they couldn't afford it. The only entities that really had the capacity to build and maintain these kinds of ships, these galleons, were the blossoming nation states of Europe. And we probably here at the Naval Academy understand this best because I think the first lesson that midshipmen are taught is that the U.S. Constitution says raise and support armies, that's temporary stuff, but provide and maintain a navy, which is permanent stuff. So again, to be clear, it was only the rise of countries like Spain and Portugal and the Dutch Republic, then France, and only after all of them, England, then Britain, were able to provide and maintain for those kinds of fleets. Next slide, please. Now, Asian vessels were big. There's no question that they were quite competent in building large ocean-going vessels, but they didn't have a response to the galleon or the galleon's successors. They possessed the technologies necessary. You know, the picture there of the Japanese swivel gun was an evolution from what was being developed in other places like China. The jongs, and these are examples of jongs from Sumatra, which had up to 7 masts, and they were physically larger than many of the earliest carracks, naus in Portuguese, that were coming to those waters during the early 1500s. But they were trading ships, so were dhows, and they were big, but they carried cargo, and they weren't designed to travel for long distances, carrying cargo, troops, and guns, and tended to take the rigors of being at sea for years at a time. Next slide, please. So why didn't Asia have this equivalent response to the European ships? The Europeans were constantly warring with each other. That little peninsula at the end of that huge continent over there was the scene probably of more battles than anywhere else on Earth. But Eastern Asia was controlled by China. It was the unitary dominant trading force. There were other trading spheres around India, and there were trading spheres around the Americas, but they didn't have that same level of competition of competing nation states specifically as you found in Europe. So it was state-level competition that drove the development of these large armed ocean-going ships. Europe had that in abundance. The other regions never did have that same level of interstate competition because, again, China was the dominant force in East Asia, and in West Asia and Indian empires, you had fairly weak trading ports, weak in terms of their political connections. They were very strong in economic terms, but the main empires were more inland, and they did not have as much interconnectivity with the ports, and there was very little real competition between those larger parts of the Indian subcontinent for trade. Next slide. So the successors to the galleons were the ships of the line, and then the East Indiamen, which you saw on the first slide of this presentation. Now, they were successors to the galleon and were evolved to meet very specific needs as war between the nation states evolved. The famous Second Hundred Years' War between the 1680s and 1815 really represented the apogee of the sailing warship. These conflicts required very heavy purpose-built warships, ships of the line, but they also required smaller ships, frigate size, which could reconnoiter and carry out other duties. But those same ships, built in the same shipyards with the same shipwrights, were also adopted for East India trade. The French, the British, and other nations built East Indiamen, which, for all intents and purposes, looked like small frigates. Next slide. Asian states, excuse me for a second. Asian states didn't begin building comparable ships, the large European-style warships, until Europe had already begun dominating Asian trade. So you see combinations of Japanese or Chinese shipbuilding techniques with European features, like behind me, the Red Seal ships from Japan and the Lorcha from China. And those were primarily used for inter-regional trade. They looked like European East Indiamen to some extent. They generally weren't as heavily armed, and they generally didn't go into battle. However, there were more than one. There's more than one example of them going into combat and winning against European nations. Next slide. Why does that matter? Why do we care? We care because the rise of the large ocean-going warship drove the European nation states to invest in technological advances that improved navigation, improved scientific understanding, improved technology in order to keep their imperial edge over the other people. So the British Academy, the Royal Academy of Sciences, the French Academy of Sciences, Berlin, the list goes on, were all developed and usually heavily funded by their respective navies because they were doing things in the Navy or their maritime interests. Britain and France are the two best examples. Here on your left, the famous chronometer by John Harrison was a Navy project. You don't build chronometers unless you need very accurate navigation. All the observatories that you can visit in anywhere from Cadiz to Paris to Greenwich up to Copenhagen, those were built for positional navigation. That wasn't to discover strange new worlds and seek out new civilizations. That was for positional astronomy. That's a Navy task. In France and in other countries, rigorous mathematics was the key to building better ships. That was the force multiplier. Science was the force multiplier to make better ships. Here you can see actual 18th century finite element analysis of a ship's hull to improve the hydrodynamic characteristics of its performance. I'm waiting for the Naval Academy's engineering group to come in and see finite element analysis, 18th century. Yes. And this was all due to naval support. Next slide. Pierre Forfait, who was one of France's best constructors, said, "A ship of the line is an extremely composite machine, or rather it is a combination of most known machines." 1788. That to me is the definition of systems engineering. So they fully understood, and Pierre Forfait was not unusual. All of his counterparts in every other nation understood this, that the armed ocean-going warship was the most advanced technology of its day and required that combination of efforts from all spheres in order to create that technological edge. And that's why the rise of the armed ocean-going vessel from as far back as 1400 was so important for our development as in the industrial age today. Thank you, and I'll save questions for the end.
All right, so next up, we have Lieutenant Commander Dennis Harbin. He is an active duty Navy judge advocate, currently serving on the Joint Staff. A qualified surface warfare officer, Dennis has held multiple leadership positions and has advised a variety of clients at sea, ashore, and overseas. A 2008 graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, Dennis earned a JD from Penn State University, a diploma in the law of the sea from the Rhodes Academy of Oceans Law and Policy, and a Master of Laws in military law from the Army's Judge Advocate General's School in Charlottesville, Virginia. His article on targeting submarine cables and modern warfare was awarded the 2021 American Society of International Law's Richard R. Baxter Military Prize. And he lives with his wife and 3 children in Chesapeake, Virginia. And I will actually move there so that I can better signal if we're running low on time.
Oh, thank you. So we were just talking right before the panel start. Is it Groces or Grotius? I think the Dutch language is de Groot. What is it? Oh, Groces. I'm going to go with Groces today.
I was going for a fight.
So I'm going to go with Groces, but I think his native language was the de Groot family. But so we're going to talk about Hugo Groces and really one of a specific character, or now, which we were just talking about, and how his involvement with the seizure of this now, the Santa Catarina, I argue in my paper, really laid the foundation for sort of what we consider as maritime lawfare, or the practicalities of what we know as the freedom of navigation operations. But I'm going to start with my history talk with the future. In the recent book, 2034, a novel of the next world war. Before I start, though, because I am a JAG, I have to say that my views expressed here today are solely those on my own and do not reflect the views or opinions of the Navy Department or Department of Defense. Okay. So, in the future, 2034, Admiral Stavridis's and Elliot Ackerman's new novel. Warships from the Chinese Navy attack, and I don't want to take it away, it's in the very beginning, but attack an American destroyer squadron in the South China Sea while they're conducting a freedom of navigation patrol. The fictitious American Commodore describes her mission as the, quote, legal equivalent of driving donuts into your neighbor's prized front lawn after he moves his fence a little too far onto your property. The fact that the historic origins of her mission to drive donuts stems from an incident that occurred near those same waters 4 centuries prior likely never entered her mind. The seizure of the Santa Catarina, which as we talked about was Portuguese now, near the Strait of Singapore in the 17th century, would inspire the development of one of the cornerstones of the rules-based order, the free sea principle. And it's going to actually be the second slide. Go up, go back all the way, keep going. Yeah, second slide. There we go. Thank you. Moreover, the effort to legally legitimize this exercise in Dutch sea power would arguably serve as the first instance of maritime lawfare. The man that developed the free sea principle, as well as the framework for using the law to legally justify defending this principle with force, was the Dutch lawyer Hugo Groces from Navies. Through his defense of the Santa Catarina seizure and in his later writings, Groces helped establish the foundation of the relationship between law and war in his monumental work, Your Belliac Pacus, or On the Laws of War and Peace. This relationship, when applied to the maritime domain, was expertly examined by Professor D.P. O'Connell in his seminal 1975 work, The Influence of Law on Sea Power. In more general terms, this relationship has developed into colloquially what we term today as lawfare. During the next 15 minutes or so, my mission is to pull the thread from the seizure of the Santa Catarina and then through Groces' ideas on the freedom of the seas and the laws of war. My intent is to show how this historical event has impacted American maritime strategy and continues to play a major role in modern great power competition in the South China Sea. Next slide. So above the 23 gallery doors leading into the House chamber at the U.S. Capitol sits marble reliefs of some of history's greatest lawgivers. Recognizable are the reliefs of Moses, Hammurabi, Napoleon, Blackstone, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson. In the same company is a man few have likely heard of, Dutch lawyer Hugo Groces, or Grotius, and there's his marble relief on the picture. His last words reportedly were, by undertaking many things, I have accomplished nothing. But that is not how history has remembered him. Groces' ideas and writings would significantly impact not only the future fortunes of his client, but the development of international law and sea power for centuries to come. Next slide. 2 of his works relevant to my paper in today's panel were Mare Liberum, or the Free Sea, written in service of his client, the United East India Company, published anonymously in 1609, and originally part of a larger unpublished work. And 2, On the Laws of War and Peace, written while in exile in Paris and published in 1625. This seminal work would cement his legacy as, quote, the father of international law and a preeminent philosopher of war, end quote. Next slide. Okay, so the history story, the seizure. So there's been a lot of writing specifically by esteemed historians about the seizure specifically and how it plays into the diplomacy of the day. My intent is not to shed new light on the details of the incident itself, but to prove that significance of this particular maritime episode to the development of the use of law to enable sea power. In the midst of the 80 Years' War between the Dutch Republic and their Spanish rulers, Dutch Admiral Jacob van Heemskerck, and that's his picture there, was attempting to establish trading posts in the South China Sea in the service of the United East India Company, are known by its Dutch language initials as the VOC. While holding a commission from Prince Maurice of Nassau, the Lord High Admiral of Holland, van Heemskerck was not a privateer authorized to fight enemy ships or seize their cargo, but was authorized to use force only in self-defense or when seeking reparations for damages. This would prove important to Groces' case the next year. Next slide. And go ahead and build that. So we got the South China Sea, and one more time. And this is where the action is. So competition was fierce in the South China Sea, with the Portuguese defending its trading dominance in East Asia by often committing atrocities against their Dutch competitors. Desiring to form a trading alliance with the Dutch, the Sultan of Johor, which is in the southern peninsula of Malaysia, tipped Van Heemskerk off to the impending arrival of a Portuguese trading fleet returning from China. Upon awaking on the morning of February 25th, 1603, Van Heemskerk, in command of the Alkmaar and the White Lion, discovered the Portuguese now Santa Catarina at anchor at the mouth of the Johor River. Next slide. Likely dwarfing Van Heemskerk's vessels, the Santa Catarina was a class of ship known at the time as being akin to a floating city. Like other naus of the era, the Santa Catarina had about a 32-foot draft, weighed 1,400 tons, was manned of about 700 sailors, and carried close to 100 women and children. As described in his reporting of the seizure, Van Heemskerk, seeking reparations for deaths of Dutch sailors who had recently been murdered by Portuguese traders, ordered his crew to aim for the Santa Catarina's sails, quote, lest we should destroy our booty with our own guns, end quote. After 10 hours of constant firing by Van Heemskerk's fleet and Johori galleys, the Santa Catarina had suffered 70 casualties, lost steerage-way, and was in danger of running aground. Due to the crudeness of Portuguese weaponry, the low profiles of the Alkmaar and the White Lion, and the high numbers of women and children on board, the captain of the Santa Catarina found it difficult to carry on an effective defense, and at 6 p.m., Captain Sebastiano Cerro signaled the white flag and surrendered the Santa Catarina and its cargo. Taken back to Holland, the vessel and cargo were adjudicated before the Admiralty Court and condemned as a fair prize. The ship and cargo was then sold off, and its proceeds distributed to the VOC, Van Heemskerk, and his crew. The capture of the Santa Catarina and its adjudication as a prize was a significant public relations story of the day for the VOC, given that, one, the Dutch and Portuguese were technically not at war, and thus the Santa Catarina was really not a prize, but that's a legal debate to have it another time. Another factor was, and more importantly, money. When the ship and cargo were sold, they grossed, quote, a sum equivalent to just less than the annual revenue of the English government at the time. So it was a huge payout for the VOC and Van Heemskerk. This, of course, brought a lot of attention, both internationally and domestically, to the practices of the VOC and its own private navy in the South China Sea. Next slide, please. At 21, Groces was hired by the VOC in 1604, quote, to legally justify the practice of capturing enemy goods. His efforts, however, were not in the courtroom, but in the arena of public opinion, with the VOC hiring him as more of a crisis response public relations counselor rather than a litigator. But version 1 of his argument was a major treatise written in 1604 known as the Commentary on the Law of Prize and Booty. That's pretty thick still. But it would go unpublished until discovered centuries later. A few years later, so in 1609, the VOC hired Groces again with hopes of influencing treaty negotiations between the United Netherlands and Spain. Groces extracted a chapter on the freedoms of navigation and trade from his major treatise written years earlier, modified it a bit, and then published it anonymously in 1609. Known in short as Mare Liberum, the complete translated title is The Free Sea, or A Disputation Concerning the Right Which the Hollanders Ought to Have to the Indian Merchandise for Trading. That's a mouthful. In Mare Liberum, Groces argued for the development of the free sea principle, relying on two foundational concepts. The first, the ability for states to trade and thus navigate freely with other states is a natural law right. So Groces was a Protestant theologian in his own right as well. So the right to trade and navigate is a right and law given from God. While nature provides all that man needs to survive, it is not all in one place. And therefore, because mankind requires trade to survive and enjoy the fruits of the earth, then man should also have the freedom to navigate on the seas in support of that trade. Women too. 2, the ocean, unlike the land, cannot be possessed as property and thus is, quote, common. Whereas mankind may be able to possess and own land, thus exercising sovereignty and jurisdiction, the ocean is different, naturally, right? Distinguishing the shore and the sea, Groces reiterates the unique characteristics that make its use common to all. Quote, but the nature of the sea differeth in this from the shore, and that the sea, unless it be in some small part thereof, like a lake or a pond or something, cannot easily be built upon, nor can be included, end quote. Put simply, because man cannot build on the ocean, man cannot occupy it. Thus, if man cannot occupy and possess the ocean, then nature has reserved it for common use. Grotius's belief that the sea is common laid the foundation for the development of early 20th century thinking on sea power and maritime strategy. Almost 3 centuries later, someone else we're all familiar with, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, in his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, would, quote, label the sea as a wide common or great common. He portrayed it as a great highway, or better, a wide common over which men may possess in all directions. I'm curious if whether he cited to Grotius or not, but you see the trend. As a preview of what Grotius would eventually write later in life, the young corporate attorney concluded Mare Liberum, arguing strongly that defending with arms the freedom of navigation and those things given to man by nature as common is just. 380 years later, Grotius's defense of the freedom of the seas would inspire the development of what we know today as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and what has become known as the Constitution of the Oceans. Next slide. But as discussed, right, this whole freedom of the seas concept was born out of a need to legitimize VOC's and Van Heemskerk's seizure of the Santa Catarina, and by extension, the use of force at sea against the Portuguese. In 1625, while in exile and living in Paris, Grotius published On the Laws of War and Peace, earning him the title, as James Madison hailed, quote, the father of the modern code of nations, end quote. Grotius articulated the causes of just war as follows and links them clearly to legal legitimacy. He writes, quote, it is evident that the sources from which wars arise are as numerous as those from which lawsuits spring. For where judicial settlement fails, war begins. Authorities generally assign to wars 3 justifiable causes: defense, recovery of property, and punishment, end quote. Because a lawful and just war relies on the rights recognized in law, when you read On the Laws of War and Peace, which is pretty large again, one may be surprised to see his efforts primarily focus on cataloging legal rights than one may find listed in a lawsuit. As one of the many rights discussed, Grotius recycles his Mare Liberum arguments, declaring, quote, the sea cannot become subject to private ownership, end quote, and I quote, it is certain that one who has occupied a part of the sea cannot hinder navigation, which is without weapons and of innocent intent, end quote, which is what we know today as innocent passage. So he's recycling these rights that he wrote about years earlier and saying these are some of the authorities and the rights justified to wage war against. Modern international law, and thus the method by which we today measure the legitimacy of military action, is more restrictive. According to the U.S. Department of Defense Law of War Manual, which cites the Grotius 7 separate times, international law recognizes 4 rationales for the resort of force. The first, which Grotius also acknowledges, is the use of force in self-defense, but this is, however, where the similarities end. The other 3 modern rationales for initiating armed conflict are the United Nations Security Council authorizes it under Chapter 7, when the foreign state consents to the military action within their territory, and in some nations believe that humanitarian interventions are a casus belli. Although there is a gap between modern law of war and Grotius's just war rationales, Grotius's efforts to link law with war and his defense of the Santa Catarina seizure suggests that, quote, while war is a morally acceptable way to prevent or remedy the violation of those rights he cataloged in exile, war should still be justified using well-established legal principles. One of those legal principles is, of course, the free sea. Therefore, when the power of the courts is ignored under the modern rules-based order, as such is the case in the South China Sea, where China has ignored the Arbitral Tribunal's 2016 ruling that their maritime claims are excessive and illegal, naval operations must be carried out to enforce the free sea, but they must be perceived and messaged as legally justified. And that perception and message is known, what I say is argue as maritime lawfare. Next slide, please. So as Professor O'Connell wrote in the 75 seminal work, The Influence of Law on Sea Power, quote, the law has never been static. Its pliable character has meant that it has been made to serve the purposes of sea power and so has become a weapon in the naval armory, end quote. While he identified in his own examination of naval history that the law of the sea has thus become the stimulus to sea power and not its restraint, is what has become referred to today as lawfare. So the term lawfare is attributed to Colonel Charles Dunlap of the Air Force, and in 2001 he was reflecting on the rise of law as a prime feature of modern military interventions. It's since expanded over the decades, and as Professor Goldensdale writes, It's no longer used as a military objective, but it's to weaken adversaries by creating facts on the ground contrary to what they would like to see, or by advancing that counter narrative, right? So it's all about the narrative and that perception of legitimacy. Lawfare can be used in legal preparation of the battlefield or shaping the environment, she writes. Next slide. Maritime lawfare, then, is the use of law, specifically the law of the sea, to enable the exercise of sea power. In fact, Groces, in his defense of the seizure of the Santa Catarina, is arguably the first recorded episode of lawfare, in that he, quote, used law to accomplish an objective that Dutch military power could not at the time, and thereby solidified that concept of freedom of the seas in modern international law. Again, quoting Alfred Thayer Mahan, sea power, though, is in the broad sense includes not only the military strength afloat and rules of the sea or any part of it by force of arms, but also the peaceful commerce and shipping from which alone a military fleet naturally and healthfully springs. And so Groces' defense of the seizure of the Santa Catarina in his writings in Mare Liberum was used to justify that VOC's use of sea power, right? That peaceful trading and shipping and commerce, but also justifying the use of arms to defend that. Next slide, please. So as American naval history has shown time and again, from the quasi-war to the Cold War, the U.S. is willing to exercise sea power to defend the freedom of the seas. On the front lines of maritime lawfare today, the U.S. enforces these freedoms through the U.S. State Department's Freedom of Navigation program. The program is conducted under a maritime legal policy premised on the belief that the United States, as President Obama declared, quote, will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, end quote. For instance, in fiscal year 2020 alone, diplomats leveraging both the law of the sea and the U.S. Navy's ability to project sea power challenged the excessive maritime claims of 19 different nations. Clearly, naval operations carried out under the program continue a tradition of the U.S. Navy using sea power to defend the legal principle of a free sea. So in conclusion, while the novel 2034 may be fictitious, the U.S. Navy's mission in the South China Sea is real. These operations that flex American sea power are the practical consequences, not only of the ideas and writings of Alfred Mahan, but of a Dutch lawyer who lived and practiced centuries earlier. As a young attorney, Groces used the law to legitimize his client's exercise of sea power in his book, Mare Liberum. To do this, he advanced an argument that the seas are for common use, and that the freedom of navigation is a natural and alienable right, defensible by arms. Later in his life, and what would contribute to his status as the father of international law, Groces zealously argued for the use of force to defend the nation's legal rights. Anchoring war to the law, he laid the foundation for the relationship between the two. This relationship is known today as lawfare. History has now come full circle, with great power competition in maritime lawfare, once again bringing the proverbial stormy weather to the South China Sea. Thus, just as the legal principle of a free sea was used to defend Van Heemskerk's seizure of the Santa Catarina and Dutch sea power in the 17th century, sea power is needed today to defend the maritime rights and legal freedoms Groces argued for centuries ago. Thank you.
All right, and our last presentation today is going to come from Commander Ryan Mewett, who's a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University and will join the History Department at the U.S. Naval Academy as a permanent military professor in 2022. His research explores how the British mercantile community shaped the development of the Royal Navy in the mid-18th century, particularly in the evolution of norms of professionalism for the officer corps. His article, "To the Very Great Prejudice of the Fair Trader, Merchants and Illicit Naval Trading in the 1730s," was awarded the Sir Julian Corbett Prize in Modern Naval History for 2019. Before selection to the PMP program, he served for 17 years as a submarine officer.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. On the 14th of March, 1757, Admiral John Byng of the British Royal Navy was executed by a firing squad on the quarterdeck of his flagship. A court-martial convened after the Battle of Minorca in the previous year had judged that Byng, quote, did not do his utmost to take, seize, and destroy the ships of the French king, which it was his duty to have engaged, end quote. Under the Articles of War, the disciplinary code that governed the Navy, the only allowable punishment for such an offense was death. The members of the court agreed that the admiral's conduct stemmed not from cowardice or disaffection, but from an error in judgment, and appealed to the king for mercy, but he declined to intervene, and Byng was duly shot. Byng was not the only execution of a commissioned officer for combat performance in the 18th century. Two captains had suffered the same fate in 1703, and a lieutenant in 1745, but it was the last. Just 2 years after Byng's death, the French philosopher Voltaire offered a sardonic explanation for the affair in his novel Candide. A character observes that in England, quote, "it is found good from time to time to kill one admiral to encourage the others." Remarkably, Voltaire's mockery has transmuted into the core of a sort of unironic historical consensus that casts a long shadow over consideration of how the Navy disciplined its officers in the 18th century. For over a century, historians seeking to explain the Royal Navy's aggressiveness at its Nelsonian apogee have pointed to the supposed salutary effects on motivation and fighting culture of Byng's execution and the rules that enabled it. Next slide, please. I reject that consensus and will offer a challenge to it and an alternate characterization of officer discipline in two parts. First, consideration of similar incidents in the 1740s to 1760s will illustrate that the Byng affair was neither singular nor representative of courts-martial generally, and did not send a coherent and comprehensible message to Byng's contemporaries and successors. Second, a broad look at the operation of courts-martial on commissioned officers shows that charges related to combat performance, like those levied against Byng and many others, comprise just a small fraction of all judicial proceedings against commissioned officers. Focusing on instances like these gives a misleading impression of how officers police the behavior of their fellows. Most officers punished by courts-martial were convicted for offenses against the usual order of shipboard society: disobedience, disrespect, and insubordination to superiors, or abuse, cruelty, and mistreatment of subordinates. The clearest statement of the Byng is turning point thesis comes from N.A.M. Rogers, The Command of the Ocean. Quote, "Byng's death revived and reinforced the culture of aggressive determination which set British officers apart from their foreign contemporaries, and which in time gave them a steadily mounting psychological ascendancy. More and more in the course of the century, and for long afterwards, British officers encountered opponents who expected to be attacked, and more than half expected to be beaten, so that they went into action with an invisible disadvantage which no amount of personal courage or numerical strength could entirely make up for." End quote. According to Roger, this revival was required after a series of courts-martial acquitted hesitant commanders and even cowards in the last war from 1739 to 1748. At the Admiralty's urging, Parliament passed a law in 1749 that consolidated and updated statutes concerning naval discipline. Most prominently, the revised 1749 Articles of War removed the court's discretion to award punishments other than death for a variety of offenses, including portions of 3 of the 4 articles dealing with performance in battle, the 10th through the 13th Articles of War. In this telling, the ascendancy of the, quote, authoritarian Whigs, in Sarah Kinkle's parlance, in politics enabled a more exacting discipline and finally empowered the Admiralty to send a clear message about its expectations. In the words of the 19th century historian John Knox Lawton, quote, "The accumulated wrath of years fell upon Byng as a first example. A second was not found necessary." Next slide, please. This account misrepresents both how sea officers were held accountable for performance and decision-making in battle in the mid-18th century and the effects of Byng's sentence on his fellow officers. Before 1749, officers had in fact been called to account for failing to engage the enemy aggressively. In the 1740s alone, at least 14 had been convicted under one of the battle-related articles. 13 of these men were dismissed from the service and rendered incapable of serving again. The 14th, contrary to Lawton's identification of Byng as a solitary example, was Lieutenant Baker Phillips, shot in 1745 for surrendering Anglesey to a French opponent after finding himself suddenly in command of a disabled ship upon the death of his negligent captain. This is an insane story. I would be happy to talk more about it. Though not obliged to do so before the law changed in 1749, the court saw fit to sentence Phillips to death, and their recommendation for mercy went unheeded. This might suggest that consistency was the main problem, preventing the threat of capital punishment from motivating officers in battle before 1749. The friendless lieutenant, in outrageous circumstances, suffered death, while 13 other, arguably more culpable officers escaped with their lives. The 1749 Navy Act purportedly bound members of court to sentence to death anyone found guilty of failing to do his utmost, quote, "through cowardice, negligence, or disaffection," end quote. But even after 1749, courts-martial regularly declined to convict on capital charges for incidents not dissimilar to that of Lieutenant Phillips and Admiral Byng. In the 5 years of war following Bing's execution, 6 more officers were convicted for behavior that could easily have been classified alongside Bing's at Minorca. 1 received a reprimand, 1 lost seniority in the captain's list, 2 were removed from command of their ships, and 2 were cashiered from the service. Captain James Campbell displayed personal physical cowardice at the attack on Havana in 1762 and repeatedly failed to support the other ships in his squadron under fire as a result of that cowardice, but was judged to fall under, quote, parts of the 10th and 11th articles, end quote, rather than the plainly appropriate 12th and 13th, which would have required a death sentence. In each of these cases, the courts carefully parsed which of the overlapping articles applied and contorted themselves to avoid the capital crimes. The effect was to neutralize any effect that the 1749 statutory change might have had. As before, courts-martial exercised significant discretion, and Bing aside, failures of aggressiveness in battle were punished no more harshly in the 7 Years' War than in the War of Austrian Succession. In the midst of the next war, in 1779, the requirement for a death sentence was removed from the 12th and 13th articles. Notionally, this revision happened because, quote, restraining the power of the court-martial to the inflicting of the punishment of death may be attended with great hardship and inconvenience, end quote. But it was more likely a recognition that the 12th and 13th articles had been rendered useless in practice by that requirement. Contemporaries immediately realized that Bing's execution was a peculiar event, and there's no indication that they felt it sent any sort of clear message about newly assured consequences for lacking aggression. The court's verdict made clear that they believed his actions to have resulted not from, quote, cowardice or disaffection, but an error in judgment only. And they wrote to the Admiralty to express, quote, the distress of their minds, end quote, over the requirements of the 12th article, and to pray for clemency. A member of the Board of Admiralty refused to sign the death warrant and resigned his position because of the contradiction of the court's opinion. Quote, his judges declare him not deserving death, but mistaking either the meaning of the law or the nature of the offense, they bring him under an article of war, which, according to their own description of his offense, he does not, I conceive, fall under. And then they condemn him to death, because, as they say, the law admits of no mitigation. Can a man's life be taken away by such a sentence? End quote. Rear Admiral Temple West, being second in command at Minorca and a powerful witness for the prosecution of the trial, was on the point of sailing from England with a squadron under his command when he heard about the sentence. He immediately resigned his commission, telling the board, quote, I can only be answerable for my loyalty and fidelity to my king and resolution of doing what appears to me best for his service, which it seems an officer may not want and yet be capitally convicted for his misconduct or inability of judging right. And I am not so presumptuous as to imagine that my actions can always be so rightly governed, nor am I altogether certain that the judgment of others is infallible. And in either case, the consequences may be fatal, end quote. There's little question that many of Admiral Bing's fellow sea officers judged his actions harshly, but his trial and execution did not establish a precedent, and they did not transmit a meaningful and comprehensible signal to the officer corps about behavioral expectations. If anything, it warned that an ultimately capricious justice could touch anyone who had the misfortune to come before a court-martial. Though cases like Bing's grabbed headlines, the great majority of judicial proceedings against commissioned sea officers in the mid to late 18th century had nothing to do with performance in battle. Next slide, please. Those numbers are pretty small, but I'll talk through them anyway. Between 1755 and 1805, 935 admirals, captains, and lieutenants were tried by court-martial. In a contemporary digest, just 14 of these, 14 of 935, were classed as, quote, officer not doing his utmost, with another 4 for combat-related, quote, error in judgment, and 2 for cowardice. Those 20 trials produced 15 convictions. Another 138 were tried for loss of their vessel to the enemy, and only 6 of these were found culpable, 6 of 138. These offenses accounted for just 17% of all officer court-martials in the 5 decades between Bing and Trafalgar. Next slide, please. Punishments show a similar pattern. Between 1741 and 1792, just 21% of commissioned officers who were sentenced to be executed, cashiered, or removed from their ship had been convicted for combat failures. Most 18th century officers who were found in violation of naval law were not like John Bing or Baker Phillips. Instead, the most common charges levied against sea officers resulted from failures to properly fulfill one's role in the shipboard social order, insubordination or disrespect to superiors, cruelty, abuse, or neglect of one's subordinates, and drunkenness, which usually manifested in mistreatment of shipmates. Roughly as many officers were tried for each of infamous behavior, 13, and cruelty, 14, as for not doing his utmost, 14. More than half of all convictions resulted from authority-related offenses like these. Examining the relative frequency of trials and convictions for certain categories of offense is perhaps the best method we have of evaluating at scale the disciplinary norms and priorities of the Navy's commissioned officers. The content of parliamentary statutes passed, quote, for the regulating and better government of His Majesty's navies, ships of war, and forces by sea, could and did reflect the interests of a variety of political stakeholders, and the Board of Admiralty could order the convening of a court-martial, but the actual conduct and outcome of trials lay purely in the hands of sea officers. This will be clear from a brief summary of the operation of the naval justice system. And I forgot when writing this paper that I was going to be sitting next to an attorney, so I apologize if I do violence to the way that court-martials work. When a commander-in-chief received a specific written complaint from an accuser that he judged to be credible and deserving of a trial, he directed a senior officer, usually his second in command, to convene a court-martial. The court comprised at least 5 and not more than 13 commanding officers of vessels on that station. They served as the judge and jury for the case. A knowledgeable layman, usually the admiral's clerk, served as deputy judge advocate, advising the court and handling elements of legal administration. The accuser served as prosecutor, and the accused defended himself. Each side called witnesses to provide evidence for or against the charges. They might submit written depositions, but the witness's physical presence and viva voce evidence was viewed as necessary to evaluate the witness's credibility and the value of his testimony. The prosecutor, the accused, and the members of the court all could question any witness. After both sides had called all witnesses and the accused had made a statement in his own defense, the court was cleared for the members to deliberate. They considered the evidence and discussed what clauses of the Articles of War might be relevant. Notably, the charge described an offense and did not identify the specific article that would be evaluated, and the court was free to choose which they thought best applied, hence their flexibility to charge with the 10th and 11th articles vice the 12th or 13th. The members then voted in reverse order of seniority to avoid senior officers' opinions carrying undue weight, with a simple majority required to convict. If the court judged the prisoner guilty, they held more votes to determine a sentence, starting with the most severe available and working downwards until a punishment was agreed. You'll see it in the minutes of the court-martial, as after they've decided on a guilty verdict, there will be, does the court judge that the prisoner deserves death? No. Does the court judge that the prisoner deserves to be dismissed from the Navy? No, and so on, down until they arrive at the actual punishment, which sometimes was just a reprimand. The parties were then brought back in, the sentence read, and the accused either returned to his duty or remanded into the custody of the provost marshal if found guilty. The professional judgment of serving commissioned officers operated on every element of this process. The complainant was almost invariably an officer from the accused's own ship, a fellow captain from the same squadron, or the accused's commanding officer. A charge would only exist if a fellow officer had judged the accused's behavior to be unacceptable, not just by the letter of the Articles of War, but by shared community standards. The admiral who received a complaint assessed the details provided therein and sometimes appointed a court of inquiry, a panel of 3 to 5 sea officers, to investigate the facts before deciding whether to order a trial. This was another opportunity for professional norms to be brought to bear in evaluating borderline cases. Of course, the most important manifestation of the community's values came in the deliberations and decisions of the court itself. The text of the Articles of War was often vague and general. Some elements overlapped significantly with one another, like Articles 10 through 13. Unlike modern legal codes, there were no supplementary materials that defined the elements of a charge or helped the members of the court determine standards of evidence. The judges could only apply their best efforts of interpretation to the plain language of the statute, and fundamentally evaluated the defendant's behavior by their own values and the professional experiences that shaped them. The accused was judged not against a clearly delineated list of duties and responsibilities, but against the general opinion among officers of how an officer should act. Hence, whatever the Articles of War said, with few exceptions, commissioned officers were convicted at court-martial for failing to uphold the standards of the community of their peers. This reality made the naval justice system an ineffective tool for stakeholders outside the Navy to shape officers' behavior. Powerful political interests could shape the legal code and in exceptional cases could compel the Admiralty to bring a charge against an officer, but they could do little to affect the values and norms of the officer corps. The example of men of war carrying merchandise for trade illustrates this point. Prohibited by Navy regulations since the 17th century, the practice was rife among ships outside of European waters and continued to be so even after pressure from merchants led to it being outlawed by statute in the Piracy Act of 1722. Certainly as late as 1739 and possibly into the 1750s, officers carried contraband into foreign possessions in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. At least 32 naval vessels visiting Africa between 1720 and 1763 bought and sold enslaved people, and several more carried away cargoes of ivory. But during the 4 decades after naval trading was formally outlawed in 1722, only one officer was prosecuted for it, Captain Thomas Matthews in 1724, at the urging of the powerful East India Company. In 1739, merchants from Bristol, Liverpool, and London presented the Admiralty with sworn affidavits from more than a dozen witnesses, accusing Captain James Cornwall of HMS Greenwich and 2 other officers of trading on the African coast and carrying 500 slaves to Barbados. The Admiralty declined to prosecute. Just 3 years later, Cornwall was tried, convicted, and reprimanded for conduct unbecoming the character of an officer when his interpretation of his orders differed from that of his admiral in a case completely unrelated to the African issue. Dozens of captains carried on this clearly illegal practice for more than half a century, but only one instance of it was ever prosecuted, even when accusations were accompanied by piles of damning evidence. Simply put, it was a common and accepted practice in the Navy. The men who made decisions about what behavior would be tried and punished had no problem with it. Merchants succeeded in having law changed. They pressed for the 1722 Piracy Act, and their 1739 political campaign resulted in its prohibitions being added to the Articles of War in the 1749 revision. But they were powerless to effect change in the culture and practices of the officer corps. When the first prosecution for trading in over 40 years occurred in 1765, it emerged from a disruption to shipboard authority. The officers of His Majesty's ship Panther in the East Indies so mistreated their crew in the course of carrying on a trade in slaves, guns, and opium that the men rebelled. The court-martial investigating the affair cashiered one officer for cruelty and infamous behavior and another for trading, while acquitting the 5 men accused of mutiny. So, 2 big takeaways to conclude. Number 1, the Byng affair did not do what historians say it did. And number 2, naval discipline in general was not typically the sort of thing that is highlighted by the Byng affair. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you all. I really enjoyed the papers. The topics are a little bit out of my usual wheelhouse, so I'll keep my comments fairly short, and then we can allow more time for questions from the audience. So collectively, these papers trace a story about how European empires consolidated control of the seas, and they also tell a story about the relationship between technology and sea power. Both naval technology in the form of these fighting ships, and legal technology in the forms of the Articles of War and the Law of the Sea. Commander Harbin describes how Hugo Groces, however we're saying that, how his legal treatises established formal precedents for freedom of the seas and just war that are still used to justify sea power today. In essence, he's describing the Enlightenment, or the Protestant Reformation, going to sea in the form of a new kind of lawfare, or the use of international law as a military weapon. So my question for Commander Harbin is whether you see imperialism built into these standards, in imperialism in the larger sense. Like Groces here is the foundation, we're saying, of modern law of the sea to some extent, and his justification for war, as well as an important precedent. And these become the backdrop for which lawfare is being waged, over which lawfare is being waged today. But his works obviously embodied, like Enlightenment European ideas and Protestant Christianity. And I was wondering if you would say that that has an effect on the nature of lawfare today, as we see so many contenders who are not don't have the same Western traditions coming into this. And in general, I'd be interested to hear more detail about what transpires between Groces and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, or or Mahan, how those ideas evolved if you're making that connection to law today. Much as Commander Harvin tells a story about justifying maritime empires in terms of Dutch national rights, Professor Ferrero also argues that the needs of emerging nation states competing for trade drove the development of unique classes of cargo ships with fighting capabilities, and eventually the emergence of more specialized warships like ships of the line. These different vessels were instrumental in securing European dominance of global trade networks, since other parts of the world did not have the same geopolitical competition that drove these developments in Europe. So my question for you would be one of sort of causation, right? Like you show and demonstrate how development of nation states influence the development of this technology. And so I was curious if you wanted to say a little bit more about the ways that this technology also fueled the development of nation states, which I think is a question sort of raised by looking at Groces and the way that some of these ideas enhance claims to national rights and things like that. And then finally, Commander Mewitt's paper reminds us that while imperial policy could be determined at the metropole, it was filtered through the will of its agents, in this case, officers of the Royal Navy. And he demonstrates that despite revisions to Britain's Articles of War designed to encourage combativeness among Royal Navy officers, it was officers themselves who had the final say in implementing this discipline. I found it particularly interesting how officers basically rendered harsher stipulations pretty much useless by just avoiding charges that carried harsh penalties. This suggests that the Royal Navy's effectiveness was not determined by lawmakers or even leaders in the Admiralty necessarily, to quite the extent that some historians assume. In fact, officers seem to have turned a blind eye or dispensed very mild punishments for a lot of infractions, leaving me with the question of, apart from dealing with questions of like insubordination, what effects the court-martial system played in shaping the command culture of the officer corps. If it didn't encourage combativeness, did it have other effects for these officers and the way they conducted themselves, or did they just assume generally that they could get away with whatever their peers would let them do? And then final question for all of you to maybe think about, since if we think about all of these subjects that you're talking about as a form of technology in some way or other, I was curious if you wanted to say anything about how these technologies spread, within the world or specifically within Europe, and how that transition and transfer of ideas and might have affected the growing imperial power. So I guess we can start with. Thank you. So if you'd like, I guess we can start with responses to that if you guys have any, and then we can maybe go to the internet and see if do we have any questions there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll kick it off. So your imperialism comment. So I think I was reflecting on that this morning. I went to one of the panels about pre-World War II naval strategy and diplomacy. And I think you've seen a trend. So if you look at post-World War II, the development of sort of this rules-based order, right? That we are out there, the U.S. Navy has been defending, in a way we've defended the freedom of the sea since the beginning. But as far as the terms of lawfare and what we're doing in the South China Sea, it's enforcing this ideal of the rules-based order. We can't take that for granted, right? The rules-based order have not always been there. Prior to that, there was might makes right. And so if you didn't have the might, you leveraged other means. And that was sort of the argument made, and Professor Ord Keetry is a law professor, I don't know what school, he wrote the book on Lawfare, 2016, really sort of the only in-depth study. And he makes sort of that connection, is that it was Hugo Groces who really did the first thing, because he used the law to achieve something that Dutch sea power could not at the time, right? They didn't have a large navy. They were just getting to the point where they would colonize the South China Sea, or East Asia. and I'm not a Dutch historian, but that's what I gather, right? So when you look, and it's the same thing, you look at the London Naval Conference or whenever, states who before the rules-based order relied on international law to set the rules, it's because they didn't have the might to get what they wanted. And so I think the imperialism question eventually shifted over to where now we live in a world where there is the rules-based order, and you see, especially China, even though it's easy to say, oh, they're just violating it, they sometimes seem to bend over backwards to at least couch what they're doing in terms of international law. And that's sort of been the struggle with UNCLOS and the law of the sea and the South China Sea, because they still feel like they have to play by the rules. So they just try to create the perception, even though it's, a fallacy that we know from the beginning. And so I think it spread that way. And to your question about UNCLOS, the freedom of the seas, Groces didn't come up with that. It was, a lot of Roman lawyers had spoken about it in the beginning, a long time ago, but he was the first to bring it into the Enlightenment period. But he, more importantly, sparked the discussion. So at the end of the day, the real debate about the freedom of the seas and the freedom of navigation was about fishing rights. And I touch on it in the paper, not in the presentation, but in Scotland and England. And the British jurists came really strong out against, and one of them, Wellwood, I think it was, or Selden, did Mari Clausen, the closed sea. And so for centuries, and that was the battle. And eventually, later in life, Groces said, okay, yeah, there will be some sovereignty and jurisdiction in the coastal. Another Deutsch lawyer, Van Binker-Schnucker, I butcher that pronunciation, but yeah, thank you. He came up with the canon rule, right? The three miles. So it started this debate between coastal rights of sovereignty and jurisdiction versus freedom of the seas, and we've eventually come to this conclusion of what is UNCLOS, and that's why it's such a magnificent, major piece of work that the international community was able to agree. And even the United States that hasn't ratified it still, says that it is customary international law. So I hope I addressed your comments.
Okay. So first I'll say thanks, Roger, for your comments, and especially for identifying that theme of imperial policy set in the metropole, but filtered through the agents and fundamentally in the power of the people at the periphery to actually execute. That's a fundamental theme of my dissertation, and I think more broadly a theme of a lot of Atlantic and imperial history being written now. You can see that happening in early modern empires. As far as what effects the court-martial system did have on officer culture, I would argue, and I'm not sure that I'm the first one to argue this, well, apart from the Bing piece, that it didn't really have an effect on officer culture, that it was a fundamentally conservative process. It was run by conservative men who were mainly interested in maintaining the social order the way that it was operating then. And so as values evolved, as you see, this is to credit Nicholas Roger with something after I've said that he was wrong about something else, that he talks about the evolution of a concept of duty as opposed to sort of glory emerging along with social changes towards the end of the 18th century. I think that has its effect on the culture of the officer corps far more than any push effect from the way the system of discipline was administered. As far as how the technologies spread throughout Europe and the world, the technology of discipline and the Articles of War, I don't want to venture too far into this for getting out of my area of expertise, but you can see, for example, that the U.S. Uniform Code of Military Justice is very strongly rooted in the Articles of War, of this period, as so many things in American naval history are, and that's a thing that I think that we could do to highlight more often and to think about more often, is that the American Navy did not spring forth fully formed from Zeus's head in 1776. It sprang forth as the brother of the Royal Navy. And so when we're looking at the early American Navy, we should be looking at the Royal Navy much more often than we do to talk about and explain why things worked the way that they did.
Okay, And your question to me was, in summary, I think, which came first, the nation state or the ship? And I think taking just a few examples, the big examples, Spain, France, England, the trend tended to be that the nation state first formed and then the ships came after. To take Spain first, you didn't see a consolidated Spanish Navy until after the War of the Spanish Succession, which took all the different provinces of Spain. You had La Mancha, and you had Coruña, and they formed into a nation under in this case, under the Bourbon rule. And it was at that point that an actual Spanish Navy started to become a real possibility. Before that, every single province had its own navy, and by the way, so did Peru and so did Mexico. But the consolidation gave them both the administrative capability to control the flow of goods and material and people, and also the money to start building up a fleet. France, I think, followed something of a similar pattern. It happened earlier. The reign of Louis XIII gave way to Louis XIV, who really put his stamp on creating a nation of France, which it hadn't really been. And it was after Louis XIV, who didn't like the Navy, that you started to see a true Royal Navy start to take shape. England's a little harder to define. If you read some works by Andrew Lambert, for example, there's an idea that the creation of a navy and the centralization that went with that drove a lot of the centralization and that became inherent within the English, later the British government. That one, because it was such a maritime nation right from the beginning, more so than almost any other of the European nations, I'd say it's a little harder to discern whether it was a chicken or egg answer. I think, however, on the main, the nation state had to be created in order to bring all of the resources, administrative powers to bear to create this organism called the Navy.
Okay, yeah, so I would only add, so I guess I was sort of getting at the chicken and egg thing, but also would you agree that there's a little bit of like kind of a feedback loop where the Navy in turn is causing the nation state to consolidate and gain power?
Yeah, I believe you can see that trend more in Britain than you can see in some of the other countries, but yes, it's an absolute feedback loop. And the thing that I found consistently the most interesting is how that naval power determined state sponsorship of things like scientific developments, engineering developments, some of the infrastructure developments as well.
Finance. By Bank of England.
Actually, that's one of the points I believe is brought up. Was Bank of England a product of needing to fund the maritime interests? I mean, one of the things that I've always thought that is most telling is when Napoleon was interred. He wasn't brought to Westminster. He was brought to St. Paul's. Westminster is the government's cathedral, and St. Paul's is the city's, the financiers' cathedral, and that's where he was first brought. So that's a very interesting tell.
You might also include Lloyd's.
Lloyd's of London, which grew out of Lloyd's Coffee House, and then Lloyd's Register, and Lloyd's. There's like 5 or 6 different Lloyd's, which later insured Betty Grable's legs. Was also instrumental. They're again, they were. This is why I said England, later Britain, was kind of. Now I'm going to butcher this Latin. Sui generis, because it is so definitely a maritime power. So much of the commerce and the identity of the country is wrapped up in its maritime traditions. Comparing it with some of the other places, even like the Netherlands. You see many more examples of where the direct influence of sea power writ large. If you read Andrew Lambert's book called Sea Power, he differentiates between sea power and maritime power and naval power. And as you can guess, Britain is the epitome of the sea power, because so much of its commerce, its self-identity, its culture is wrapped up in being able to dominate not just the sea militarily, but trade and everything from trade to fishing to just the way they see themselves.
All right. Do we want to go to questions from the internet?
I have one moment from Craig Chapman. He asked to Lieutenant Commander Harbin, did other European nations concur with mare liberum in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Yeah, so I think there was, well, I'll take that. I don't know whether like nation states necessarily, like their governments would have endorsed the policy. Some may have not. So Mare Liberum was written again about trading rights in the South China Sea, and then that's all great because that was on the other side of the globe. It was really the British that threw out the greatest opposition, right, because of fishing. He made one comment, I think it's like 90 pages, and he made one or two comments about fishing as an example. And some British jurists and Scottish and English just, freaked out about the fishing rights. And then that created the back and forth. But I think overall, there was the consensus that, yeah, the seas are sort of a free place. It's just what measure from really the coast, right? At what point is it the fishing? Is it, coastal resources or things like that? I think there was consensus on the open ocean or in the high seas. Sure, you can navigate. And in fact, Scottish and English jurists kind of conceded that point. And then Groces came back and wrote a counter argument saying, well, it's actually not as clear because our Dutch traders have been murdered right in East Asia trying to sail and navigate over there. So it's a little back and forth, but overall, I think the general consensus was, yeah, sure, freedom of navigation is fine, but let's talk about when those ships get closer to shore and what that tension between coastal rights and jurisdiction versus the freedom of navigation is. And you see that still, I think it was finally resolved in the UNCLOS later, and it took 380 some years.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, should have looked at the camera.
Yeah.
I got a question for Ryan. Thanks for your paper. Can I ask a follow-up after I ask my first question?
Sure. I'll allow it.
Do you reject the culture of aggression argument in addition to being the cause of the culture of aggression?
Empirically, it seems to be true. I have no reason to reject it.
Okay. So if that's the case, then what explains it, if it exists?
Your guess is as good as mine. No, honestly, I don't know that I have a really good answer to that.
Then I need a third question.
the thing that framed this project in a way was, I think that the Bing story is just a pat story. Like we see a thing that you can say happened, and here's a thing that maybe caused it. Yeah, okay, that caused it.
I take the point. I think that's good. But then let me ask a leading question. But I think you don't necessarily agree with this. What role do you think that honor played in if there is a culture of aggression?
I think it played a big role because you can see. I mean, that's a thing that you see in the texts of the court martials, and in the way these people, in the way officers. There's a reason that there were 168 court martials over that period for officers who had lost their ships, and it wasn't because in all those cases it was thought that maybe somebody did something wrong. It was a lot of those cases were it had become a practice that it would happen, but that was because men wanted to publicly and obviously clear their names. They wanted everybody to know that they were honorably acquitted, that they had done nothing wrong in the loss of that ship. You see it also, a number that I didn't throw out there was, in addition to those 168 losses of ships to the enemy, there were hundreds for groundings that comprised another big chunk of that, and it was the same story. There's almost no convictions for it. which is a sort of amazing concept to us now, that they would lose their ship to preventable accidents and people would not be convicted for it. But anyway, yes, the short answer is I do think honor played a big role, and that's why I say I think it was a cultural change beyond the bounds of the officer corps and beyond the operative mechanism of court martials and discipline operating within the officer corps to change the culture. I think the culture of Britain and British gentlemen changed over that time, and that changed the officer corps culture.
Maybe, we should talk later, maybe, but I would say the honor stuff is older.
Yes.
So then if you're going to explain that duty is the thing that's coming in, then you also have to explain, for example, why they're still dueling in the 1830s. So
Yeah.
I think there's something that has to happen. If honor is the cause of the cultural progression, then there's got to be something else happening in the 1790s and 1800s, for example, when supposedly duty has come back to.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I don't know what the answer is. I think honor has something to do with it, but I don't have a good alternative
Thank you, Your Honor, I yield my time.
Quick to Groce's question, understanding he or any sane human being couldn't have imagined that the Chinese could have built islands in the middle of the ocean. If he believes that control of the ocean is what you can build upon, and he said that a navy is like a land army insofar as it can restrain somebody from doing something, do you surmise or suspect that he might have changed his opinion in today's world where a navy, the U.S. Navy won't get in sight of land now over the horizon targeting, and then you have the Chinese building things in the middle of the ocean?
Yes, sir. No, great question, thanks. So he did, when the primary opposition wrote Mari Clausum, they were like, well, you make this argument that the sea can't be possessed and controlled. Well, that's just false. I mean, sort of theoretically and by natural law and what God has given in common and et cetera, maybe, but in realistic, we have ships with guns. And the very fact that you had to defend this use of sea power is just proof that the sea can be controlled. So, right, so this foundational concept, there were two of them, that the ocean can't be possessed, therefore it should be common, is just not true, because in reality, it is. And he's sort of, again, and I made the point a couple times, he was a corporate lawyer, right? So Mare Liberum, this foundation of really the cornerstone of international law and the rules-based order, it could be argued that its foundation was based on a corporate lawyer serving its client, right? The VOC at the time. Later in life, when he was a little disillusioned, and I commented he was in exile, essentially he had to leave the Netherlands for some religious tensions, etc. He was a little bit more tempered, and that's when he accepted the fact, okay, there can be some control, there can be some jurisdictional and exercise of sovereignty out from the shore. Would he have said otherwise, with the thinking of aircraft carrier? I think it would have probably come out to be the same thing. And we see this concept still with artificial islands and UNCLOS trying to tap this down. So at the end of the day, this discussion about possessing the ocean out there, right, is in a way has sort of been answered through UNCLOS to that. That answers your question.
Just a comment with regard to a specific court martial that occurred in 1813. Captain John Quillam, Royal Navy. His frigate was patrolling, or had left St. John's, Newfoundland. And this one particular day, or towards the evening, a large sail was spotted. They approached it, and it was one of our frigates. To this day, we're not sure which one it was. He failed to pursue and engage. His first lieutenant accused him of cowardice and and not performing his duty. On arriving back to England, he was court-martialed. Now, what was interesting is that the admirals overseeing the court-martial knew as well as Quillam of his secret orders. And if you all remember, after the single ship actions of the Constitution of the United States, Admiralty orders were for British ships not to engage these large American frigates individually. His orders were in his great cabin. The jury, the admirals, knew of those orders as well. And everything that was presented by his first lieutenant, it was obvious that he did not perform his duty. But no one, neither did the defendant, John Quillen, or the board, verbalized the fact that he was carrying out his orders because it was state secret, obviously operational secrets. If we had known that, obviously there's something going on. So that was just a fascinating aspect of what transpired during the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, obviously with us.
Was he convicted?
No, he was exonerated, even though when you look at the evidence that the first lieutenant brought to the court found him not guilty.
There was a very similar case from 1757, right after Bing's trial, about 6 months later, where a similar thing had happened. A ship saw what seemed to be maybe a big French ship heading into port. They were off the coast of Brest. They followed him for a bit. They thought it wouldn't be prudent. The captain said it wouldn't be prudent to engage. It looks like a ship of the line, or a fifth rate or a frigate or something like that. They didn't engage. As they were moving away, something happened that revealed that it was a French East Indiaman. And at that point, the captain said to the lieutenant, "No, I have orders to deliver these dispatches over here, so we're not going to go chase him after all." And his lieutenant did accuse him of cowardice for not attacking, and same sort of thing. He was found not guilty, even at 6 months after the Bing thing had happened. So it sort of shows that there is a lot more complexity to these cases than just a simple open and shut.
Any other questions?
Are any of you familiar with the Plymouth Mutiny and the effect on the officer corps of the Royal Navy?
Plymouth Mutiny?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
The Great Mutiny, yeah. You know what happened to the Royal
Are
Navy?
you talking about 1797?
I think so, yeah.
Redhead in the north?
They were held in the Royal Navy was held in disgrace. And you know how that's illustrated even today?
No.
They don't have a hook on their sword belts. So whenever they're wearing their sword, they have to carry it. Weird. I found that out quite by accident in Australia. I was visiting Hobart, and the Australian officer who was with me kept carrying. He said, "Bring your sword belt on the hook," and he said, "We don't have a hook." And he explained it was because of the.
I have heard that explanation before.
Yeah. And when I was in Vietnam, I had commanded a ship off the coast of Vietnam, and I had a map that was a commercial map. And all the islands that are now in dispute were listed on that map as Chinese. But that's before we recognized communist China.
Was there another? Yeah.
Ryan, I just had a sort of a comment question. It's interesting, you're fighting against this mythology of being an execution, but then there may be a power or truth to this sort of myth, because of Lawfare, right? And I'm thinking of, Napoleon famously has one of his ship captains executed after the Battle of Basque Roads. And then he wants another one executed in 1811 because he thinks it will inspire his soldiers. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll swear I'll look back. I think he even references being in the British. So there's this interesting dynamic where there may not be a reality to it on the British side.
Yeah.
Other people see it and pick up this myth.
That's a great point. I think he also tried to execute Villaret Joyeuse, maybe?
No, Villaret Joyeuse, no. He doesn't know. Villeneuve, there's the whole thing about the death of Villeneuve after Trafalgar, but no, the two, he has one executed after Basque Roads, the other one who doesn't follow orders while out in the Indian Ocean. The court-martial finds him guilty and breaks his sword, but not executed. Napoleon's livid, he wanted him shot.
I'd be really interested to read about, particularly the references to things, so I'd like to talk about
Yeah, if I can find it, I'll definitely forward it to you. So.
Any other questions? Anyone at home for that matter? Sorry?
My wife is on screen.
Yeah.
You should wave. Do we have to go to the reception?
Yeah. Well, we can call it there then, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed
I decided that the last minute I was going to redo my comments, so I'm sorry. I was like,
Well,
Yeah, no,